Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them. I'm here with my co-host, Greg.
Hello, hello.
And this is going to be a show about choices, as promised. We're going to just jump right in here. We've got a lot to talk about this episode. It's actually going to end up being a two-parter, but Greg will tell you more about that at the end of the episode. So, the first thing I wanted to discuss was the difference between, well, first of all, what we're going to be focusing on this episode, because it's going to be a two-parter about choice. And so this first episode, we're going to be talking mostly about choices with regard to the storyline. Choices are everywhere in video games because they're interactive. So anytime you have something that's interactive, you get to choose how you want to interact with it. And so we're choosing to narrow our focus.
Especially that word's going to lose all meaning by the end of this.
Choice. Just let it happen.
No.
Choice.
Oh my gosh.
So we're going to focus on story choices and how when you make decisions that affect the storyline.
Yeah.
And we're also going to talk a little bit about how games present those choices to you, or sometimes don't present those choices to you, but just sort of expect you to make decisions.
Yes.
And some of the difficulties and pros and cons with how they do that. Something I want to talk about right at the beginning is the difference between decisions about what action you're going to take, and then a game that really highlights the results of those decisions. So in both cases, the decision itself is very important, but games can choose to focus differently about whether they want to focus at the beginning, that's sort of at the forefront of the decision, and whether they want you to think a lot about what you're about to do. And if you can imagine like a sequence where you have to, do some sort of elaborate task in order to finally fire, some weapon at a nearby town, and you're having to think about what you're doing and the fact that you're about to, bomb this little village or something, and I'm trying to think of a game that actually does this because an example would be fantastic.
As in, like, kind of giving you that moral quandary, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. Like having a build up to a choice that is like sort of questionable.
Yeah. Well, I can think of there's always almost one scene like that in each God of War game where you have kind of a puzzle, and usually the puzzle ends up killing someone, like a prisoner.
Right.
Kind of they're a part of the puzzle, and you have to utilize them or sacrifice them to someone, or put them in a position that's going to kill them, but gets you to the next stage.
Right, so I think God of War is a good example. So
you don't really have any
choice
if you want to actually progress, but it's usually and it's very obvious. It's usually kind of gratuitous in the way of God of War, and it's kind of obvious what's going to happen, but you just kind of have to kind of keep on doing it.
Right, and so there you're not given a choice, but it's still a game that sort of you are, right? I mean, you can choose to stop playing the game, but you don't, and so in order to keep continuing with the experience, you've got to do this thing. And so,
which we'll get to later as well.
Right.
The specific idea.
I think it does focus, like, make you focus on what you're choosing to do, and what the actions your character are taking. And so you kind of get to go through maybe what Kratos is going through while he's putting together this, puzzle and getting ready to torture this individual.
Right.
And then the opposite of that would be a game that sort of a lot of times rushes you through a decision. You make it really quick, really briefly, and then you get to see the results of those choices unfold. And it's funny, the game Kindergarten is a pretty interesting game that came out recently. But that's a game where I would say the decisions are... it's more of a puzzle game, honestly, but the way that you make decisions are pretty quick. You just kind of answer, you go through a dialogue tree, but then sometimes you'll see a child get murdered in front of you.
Whoa, what kind of game is this?
It's a cartoon game, so it's less gruesome than it sounds.
Yeah, fair enough.
But it's supposed to be dark. It's very black humor.
Yeah.
So I would say that's a game that's, or at least that part of the game focuses more on the consequences of like, oh, all I said was like Susie was mean to me, or like, or you can tell the teacher that the bully in the schoolyard tried to take your money,
Right.
and then she'll go over and she'll kill him.
Yeah.
It's like what?
Whoa. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a game that has
That's actually
like
a good example because that's so extreme, right? Usually games are a little bit more subtle about that
right.
in terms
And
of a choice you make and then a consequence. That one's like super obvious.
right. And like that you expect it from that game. Like in the
Right.
like one of the first mistakes you make is like talking to the janitor and then like you say the wrong thing and he kills you and you're like, "What the heck?" And so it's just the game introduces you pretty quickly to the idea that like, yeah, if you make a misstep here, it's going to have bad results.
Yeah, like over the top. Yeah, unrealistic.
Right.
consequences.
And so I'd say that's a game that focuses on like the consequences of your actions and what's going to happen because the game is trying to get these chain of events, this sort of Rube Goldberg of decision making to line up perfectly.
Sure. And you have
so
to find the one-way path through it, kind of.
Exactly. Yep. And there might actually be multiple endings, but there's a lot of ways to die. So
Right, kind of like adventure games, right? We talk about this a lot when you think about like dialogue trees. When you're in an adventure game and you find a person and you have to find kind of the one narrow path through all of these branching dialogue options in order to get either a piece of information or the thing that you need out of them, or to accomplish the goal or the purpose of initiating that conversation. It's similar where each step of the way you kind of have and in theory, and probably same thing with kindergarten, in theory, the game would be written in such a way that you're able to learn, like an adventure game with a character, hopefully it'd be enough storytelling or enough kind of implicit information given or background information or just enough conveyed by the character itself that you can kind of figure out what makes the person tick and, figure out your end goal and then pick dialogue options that you think will be able to influence that person in that way. Like that's something we were talking about. We watch a show by a streamer called Day 9, and he most Mondays will do a show called Mostly Walking, and they play adventure game. Him and a couple of his friends play adventure games, and many times they're really bad ones. And
yes.
and the most recent one we've been watching is really just like dirt tier video game. It's really fun to watch. Point is, one of the things we've been noticing was in the dialogue options, it's almost random. It's like almost random with what you say and what response you get. And within the same conversation, you can like insult this person horribly and they'll get you to the next stage, and then you'll like insult them again, or you'll like say something kind of edgy as if that's what they respond to, and then they'll immediately stop talking to you, and you just have to go back, and suddenly they want you to be sweet. It's this almost like schizophrenic style of relating with people.
Oh yeah,
which is a complete failure in that regard, right? You're not making any your choices and your consequences aren't matching up. Yeah, it's almost random.
Right. It feels like the signal to noise ratio is way off. Like,
yeah, totally.
There's of course people aren't always going to respond how you think they're going to. So
yes,
there's going to be relationships are noisy in that way. Like it's hard to get a read on people sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
But like you've got to give players something, otherwise it just feels like you're doing things random.
Right. Otherwise, the core mechanic of the game, which is there's adventure games have very little mechanic to it, right? You just point and click and you move and you select things. That's not the hard part. It's trying to figure out and puzzle things out. So the very core thing the game asks you to do, especially if it's very heavy in dialogue, as this adventure game is, it's not as much find things as much as talk to people and get stuff. Then you better be damn sure that you have built a very robust system for that to do, and where a player can learn and make it difficult and maybe some randomness or some curveballs. But in large part, this one failed in that regard. in spectacular fashion, though, so in a very fun way. Go watch. What is it called? Tex Murphy, I think, and the Martian Memorandum.
It has a subtitle which implies that there's more than one of these.
Yeah.
Which makes me a little sad.
And we looked.
And there are many.
There are like six or eight or something like this. A frightening number.
Yeah.
But it was also like 1991, and video games were...
Go watch them play it. I don't really recommend that you play it.
Yeah,
it's kind of it's similar. You could just like go get a nice cutting board and hit yourself with it.
Yeah, exactly. It's similar to tell you to like watch Family Guy, but not act out any of the things they do with your family.
Yes,
it's not the point of that kind of media. Anyway, I forgot where. Okay. So we were talking about courage and consequence, and I think it's worth. And Mark was alluding to this earlier, but just. Especially because next week we're probably going to do another episode actually on choice in a different sense, but this week we're only talking about in large part just story choice, so your ability to do something in a game and have the story change or your experience of it change. as opposed to necessarily mechanical choice, right, where you have tons of different ways to choose how to play the game, either different skill trees, or different abilities, or different
Paladin, or
right,
things like
exactly.
that.
Or even so, yeah. So that's only we're going to be talking about today, and yeah, I mean, at very base, right? Games are in fact the reason we play games as opposed to watch things is because you can interact with them. They're interactive. That's what makes a game a game. So by default, you're always utilizing choice in terms of the way that you play a game.
Which is
Um,
why this is such a broad topic.
exactly. We were talking about this pre-show. We were like, oh crap, this is like
At
this
least 2 episodes.
Yeah, exactly. So today we're just going to try to focus very clearly on story mechanics, and how those work, and the different ways that players and games, and it's only semi-recent, I guess. I mean, I grew up in the '90s, and playing game, PS1 and that era were kind of my first early games, and in large part, you didn't have too much choice in story making because games were smaller, and in large part, they didn't have the resources to put that much content into a game. So this is actually, I think, a semi. I guess maybe not anymore. Maybe like a semi new thing at least, and a weird one too. It
I would say within the last like probably 15 years of
Yeah, I was gonna
gaming.
say maybe around 10, um, but
Knights of the Old Republic strikes me as a game that was like kind of high. They really talked a lot about the choices and the depth of the decisions that you
yeah, yeah, that one was.
and that was best.
Yeah, for sure. That one was more like relational. I mean, yeah, you had different endings, but there was a very core uh, narrative, and I guess we can talk about that too in terms of like one way to give an illusion of choice, or I guess it's real choice, but a way to keep the narrative super focused and moving in the direction that you as the developer want it, and hence have not cut down on the sheer amount of ballooning storylines you might have to tell, is something called choice diamonds, which just kind of refers to, if you looked at it, if you draw it out as a diagram, then that's the shape it'll make. But getting to a point, having two different decisions you could make, having them branch off legitimately, and you go to the side for a little bit, and those two, depending on what you choose, or three, you'll have a different experience of the story, and different things will happen. But within the next story hit might be will be identical. You'll come back to a single one, as if no matter what you choose, you'll still get that next step after.
And so there that way that it's an advantage for the developers because they give players real choices with real consequences, and they don't have to make two completely separate games starting from that choice point and
Right.
going on, right? Which is a lot of content to
I
have to
mean, yeah.
make.
Think about it. If you had really true, each choice was completely unique, that you make in storylines, then you would that's exponential, right? It very quickly becomes multiplicative, and soon you have hundreds of potential endings and ways that the game can be played. And unlike real life, where you can do that actually, because life isn't being computed. Although, well, let's not get into that. But
Oh gosh,
whatever computer we do have, if it is a computer, is powerful enough to apparently.
it's pretty
Yeah, it's
ball.
pretty dank. It can process, but for games, you just can't actually simulate reality that well, and so there has to be some restriction on it, which I maintain is actually a good thing. And I don't know, Mark, you can push back on this if you want, but again, I maybe I'm old fashioned. Maybe it's because the golden age that I grew up on in game, like everyone kind of has. They talk about like a golden age of media, which is usually between the ages of like 8 and 10, when you're kind of beginning to figure out your own taste, and tends to be the stuff that you experience during those years is really really special to you, for the rest of your life. And for me, those games were almost entirely linear single player games. Um, and so I reflect really, really fondly on games that were really well crafted. You had very, very little to no choice in, both in terms of the way you played, or the story itself. But to me, and I've talked about this before, that kind of speaks to this. There's kind of this purity of intent on the developer's point, and if they're a good developer, then they'll be able to really craft this really wonderful experience that you get to play. And the danger of giving, particularly with story, a lot of different choices is that, it's very difficult to maintain one, from a story perspective, like a theme or a character development and all that jazz through with variables, but also it's very difficult to make an overarching kind of statement, and have the player experience something cohesive, right? You have to kind of dilute your story hits or your characters so that they can, in fact, deal with all these unknown variables that might come in and still make sense, right? You have to build in kind of this vagueness so that they can have all these different other things happen to them and still be able to sort of make sense. But to me, that kind of like you lose something there. I wonder if necessarily you have to give up something from a story perspective if you're going to allow the character or the player to really truly choose all of them. Because I don't know, I don't know if I can buy that every single version of the story is equally good or equally compelling or equally deep.
It's hard to make a compelling case that you can have a character who uh, has a deep and understandable and clear uh, more like character.
Yeah,
Like I don't, I'm using the word character two different ways here, but like
I know.
has like
Personality, set of traits, characteristics.
convictions and convictions and personalities who would legitimately make any
Yeah,
of these
right.
choices. Like,
Yeah, at some point, yeah, that's another thing, right? Is
but
if you can totally uh, jolt the character, the player out of immersion for a story. If
right.
you've been building this character to be this incredibly generous, altruistic, kind person, and you still keep on getting options for like curb stomp puppy, as like an option, and
Yeah,
you're like,
exactly.
would he do that? Like, he could. Like, that's not how necessarily how it
Right.
really
I could
works.
make him do
Right.
that, but
Have it totally be disparate.
to your point, Greg, that's like it makes it a worse story because the character's doing things that the character wouldn't do.
Right.
Like you've developed this character, you've taken the time to communicate a personality to the
Right.
player, and then you just let them
Right.
violate it. And
Right.
like so that I do think that that lowers the quality of the game when that
So I
happens.
suppose.
And I think it happens on a lesser extent with most games don't go that extreme where like yeah you curb stomp a
Right.
puppy or
Exactly.
something, but there are still choices you can make that align with the character you're making them for, and there are choices you can make that don't really
Right.
seem to.
And I would say in general, like you said, there's obviously people are complex and they can make differing and sometimes difficult to understand choices. So I'd say a good game that would do that would be able to have, you don't have to have this completely characterless person, who's just this blank slate so they can do anything. You can still develop, traits and stuff and then give, plausible interactions with them to have. But I think in general, and that's another piece. There's another way that sometimes games do this, which is limiting actually your choices. So if there's like a morality system, like in like Knights of the Old Republic, or SWTOR, the kind of the MMO sequel to that, or Infamous is another one, where you have kind of cumulative good and dark, like light side, dark side, basically the idea. And if you
Hmm.
have done enough things, good things, or enough light side points, then you'll get certain options that you wouldn't, and you can't even see the dark side choices. And that's kind of and vice versa. So that can be kind of a sliding scale, which that's an interesting way to address that because on one hand, I think it's cool in that again it speaks more to your character, and yeah, of course you wouldn't be getting the option to like torture someone with Sith lightning if you've been doing all these good altruistic force loving things for the whole game as a Jedi. But on the other hand,
Right.
that also, and this maybe can get a little bit into the next bit, which we were talking about, which is how much feedback games actually give you about what your consequences are. Like basically, if you do something, you make a choice, and the game doesn't tell you if there's a hidden system where it doesn't tell you that it's keeping track, but doesn't tell you it's keeping track. It can actually be very difficult and jarring for a player as an experience when suddenly you don't have certain options that you thought you might because you don't really understand
Right.
the mechanics behind what it's doing. Um, so either A, the game communicates that really, really well, and you can see, you have a numerical system of, hey, this many points will unlock this sort of choice, and the game tells you that, which is kind of, I don't know, it seems sloppy. Or B, it's really, really good at implicitly showing you that, hey, these types of actions will have these types of consequences, and just as you play naturally, you begin to get a sense of the way the game works, and hence can kind of intuitively make those decisions and ensure that you get the right types of choices you want.
Yeah, it seems like there's an interesting tension between like there are definitely lots of games who choose to focus on consequence, like we talked about, and lots of times you'll make those decisions and you won't even realize that oh, this is going to have terrible consequences down the road. But it's something different, I think, to force a player into a situation where they're not expecting to be because they didn't realize like that they were making meaningful choices.
Right, yeah, totally. Yeah, if it doesn't communicate that this is a meaningful choice, then most gamers probably default to it not being the case, right? You tend to kind of be wacky in video games in
Right,
general.
and there are
So
games that I think take advantage of that. Like Chrono Trigger famously has a scene where you do a
yeah,
bunch of little small actions, and then the game brings it up to you later on. Um,
right,
and Red Dead Redemption is a little bit more about choice, but you can, choose to do terrible things, and they will catch up with you. And
right,
uh, and I think it can be jarring to the player because you're like, what do you mean? It's just a game. But like then the game all of a sudden takes itself really seriously and is like, I can't believe you would, disrespect that old lady by taking her spot on the train. And you're like what? It's just a game. I just
right,
sat down.
right.
Like I
Yeah.
didn't realize she even wanted a seat.
Right, I
Yeah.
pressed A. Yeah, so no, so totally. That's like the example I was thinking of was actually Heavy Rain, which is a story-based game. And in large parts, that's another little kind of trope we can talk about here, I guess, for a second. As a side note at the end of this, remind me to come back to this. The idea of basically having no consequences to your actions until the
Right.
very end, and getting different endings, so ending forking. But so in Heavy Rain, in large part, you have kind of maybe little diamondy stuff here and there, like we were
Hmm.
talking about. But in large part, it's just you have a lot of choices you can make, and you have results to them. But in large part, the only time you see consequences is the very end of the game. You get certain endings, and there's very little. Like I said, there's very little indication that that's the case, or what your decisions are actually doing for your character. So basically, you beat the game, and depending on what you did, you get certain endings for certain
Right.
characters. Problem was that you didn't have any indication that the game was keeping track in those ways of some of those things, and had no sense of how to really manipulate that. Which on one hand could be a cool thing if the game is going for just trying to really make you make decisions under stress, and then you kind of get the result that you were going for. Trying to keep you kind of immersed and not thinking about what you're
Right.
doing so much, right? But on the other hand, if you're trying to craft these narratives and like saying, hey, I want this person to kind of be this way, um, and you kind of you misjudge that, or you don't entirely kind of hit the mark on what the game thought that should look like, and then you get this ending for a character that you invested like 20, 30 hours in. That's really dissatisfying, especially for a story-based game, which is all Heavy Rain is. I mean, there's almost no mechanic to it. It's basically a bunch of quick time events with some narration.
What do you mean when you say you're
So that
unsatisfied with the ending?
Well, because like if you've had this version of this character in your mind, right? And like I said, there's versions of there are choices you can make in the game. And so like say one of the characters is an FBI agent who's trying basically that game's about a boy gets kidnapped by a serial killer, and you take the place of four different characters basically trying to find the kid in different ways. One of them's an FBI agent who gets called in, has no history in the town, and that is kind of played as a straight detective case, and you go and you find suspects and you can interrogate them in different ways. And say you're playing this detective, you can either play him very very brutally, or kindly and kind of anti-system, and standing up to some of the corruptness in the police station, right? So if you're trying to play him in this really um, altruistic, positive sense, and maybe here or there you make a decision that you didn't really realize was going to affect some of those things, then because of those little tiny decisions that you made along the way that you kind of
Mm.
missed, you get this ending that something like he and this has happened actually, where you get these seemingly very at odds endings for the way you played your character, where he plays it, he gives into rage at the end of the game and something and kills the murderer, right? Like that's not one of the actual endings, but
Right.
that's kind of the potential for the way that could work, and there are examples of that in the game, with endings that don't match the way you can play them. And the reason that came about, like I said, was because there were these little moments that maybe the game valued higher than you on that like rage quote unquote
Hmm.
scale, and that you didn't really think too much of, and you missed it, and hence you end up getting this result that was entirely different than the way you were playing and expecting the character to act. Because for the ending, you finally don't have control anymore, right? You just get watch the cutscene and
Right.
and that's it.
That's
And so that can really make you feel like you wasted all your time and energy on this character, trying to make him something, and then the game's like, nah, and then yeah, just narratively you feel like kind of dripped.
right. Yeah, because you thought that you were playing the player, so the character a certain way in the game, and it's very limited choice to sort of sample your decisions and summarize how you were
Right.
playing the character. Basically, got it wrong. Um,
Right.
And it seems like
So
there's
as a
there's going to be a real tension, and we're going to get to story choice mechanics later. There's a it's
yeah
difficult to make the choices subtle, and that like okay, everybody's
yeah
played like Mass Effect,
yeah
where it's like you want to do the good choice or the bad choice, and like so
right.
that's then the player
That's not
it's not
satisfying either,
satisfying. The
right?
player knows exactly what the game is doing behind the scenes. Like, oh, this is a point in the good column, this is a
Mm.
point in the bad column. But it's also kind of
Right.
hokey. But there's a problem
Yeah.
on the opposite side of the spectrum that you're describing, where it's too subtle, and the character's like,
Right.
I want to communicate that this is a good guy who is,
Mm.
above the corruption in the city and wants to do the right thing. How do I communicate that to the
Right.
game? I've got to do it through this like
Right.
mysterious sort of choice thing.
Right. You kind of have to
Exactly.
guess, and best you can, and you have to trust that the game is well designed and really good at that. But I think I would tend towards, just as a player, much preferring the latter, right? The behind the scenes
Right.
version of it. That just requires a whole lot more. I don't know, patience, uh, attention to detail and sophistication on the part of the
I
game.
think a way that
Usually, I don't trust games, so I like being able to see exactly what it's doing, so I can make sure I get the result I want.
right when you're crafting a
So I can
story,
understand the system.
it seems like
Right. But ideally, it would be this intuitive thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I wonder if there's even a place for being able to make like reparations for things that you do that end up going wrongly. Like
Yeah.
if the game is going to go ahead and categorize, like it can give you a subtle choice, but if it's chosen to categorize that as kind of a shady thing to do, if it can hint at that and then
Yeah.
give you a chance to undo that, I think that would be just
Right.
brilliant for a game. Like you say something that
Yeah.
slights somebody you didn't mean to, but later before you leave the room, you can go over and apologize, and then like kind of fix that. Obviously, there are some choices that you can't really undo, but hopefully those are
Right.
clearer. Like if you kill somebody, it's
Right.
like okay, well that's a pretty brutal thing to do.
Right. With the example I was using earlier, right, of like a detective. Say you make this choice and then trying thinking that you're making one that's going to make him more docile, and then you get a cutscene where he freaks out, and it's understood that you can actually keep on affecting him. You're like, hey, that's feedback the game gave you that he's still in this state where he's unstable and might still give in to kind of like these uncouth interrogation techniques. Then you can be even more careful about your next set of decisions you have to make sure that he doesn't do that if you don't want him to do that.
Right.
So that brings me to another tiny point being well, I told you to go back. We were going to talk about ending forking, right?
Sure, sure. I'll do that. So we've already talked about choice diamonds, and when you make a true fork at the end, it's sort of a get out of jail free card for the developer because the end of the diamond, it actually is still a diamond, but the end of the diamond is the roll, the roll credits, right? It's the end of the game.
Right,
So
that's a good point. Yeah, the
it
game,
does. You still get the
it
same.
all comes back to
Right, you
game
still get
over.
the same ending, which is like end of game, thanks for playing. You can make the choice seem more permanent and open-ended because there's no more story to be told. And so you can
Right.
still get the benefit of not having to create 10 entirely different games, and yet you can have 10 different directions that the story could fork at the very end. And so if you just, you fork the last 10 minutes into 10 different little sort of side stories, then you get the player gets the sense that, oh, what I did really mattered here, and it changes the way things going forward, but without ever actually having to fill in those blanks as a developer. And so
Yeah,
it's a technique that a lot of developers use, a lot of games use. I would say to decent effect, but it can have
yeah, yeah,
the difficulty of what you described, Greg, which is it can be frustrating if you're making decisions that you don't realize are going to affect the story later on, or you think are going to affect the story later on, but you just think it's going to be different than how it actually affects the story. Like
yeah,
if you're really engaged with trying to craft the narrative and the game basically communicates you failed at that, that can be frustrating.
yeah, yeah, totally. And that's then yeah, that makes some sense. I think it's and so I'm kind of torn on this. Like you said, I think that is true that game forking, like end forking, can be a good thing or like a can be well done, and you can have multiple different endings, and that's fine. I think the interesting thing to me is that, and this is just me personally, but like you're talking about how it ends, it does diamond back to an
Right.
end, which is just like the game's over. But I don't, I wonder if actually maybe it doesn't, and in fact it's a loop until you've actually finished all of the, and because like for me the game isn't over. Like an ending, a true ending where there's only one of them means this is done and this is it and it's final. But when there's multiple endings, there's more things to find. there's more stuff in the game. There's more ways it could have gone for me, and I need to see all of them to get a sense of, a full picture of the game. So the loop is actually for me back to the beginning. It's not an actual end. It's a play again
Until
kind of
you get
thing.
to see all
Um,
those choices.
right. I guess the final one would be, yeah, when you finally seen everything. But to me, so like this is a weird thing where, again, maybe it's just with my older ideas about story or just desire for kind of
Your old
enclosed, well crafted
ideals.
experiences. I know, right? But I tend to not be. I tend to like. I'm always trying to figure out, like, especially with a story in a game, like what it's trying to communicate and like what I was supposed to take away from it and like why it matters and what it tells me about, myself and people and yada yada yada. And I feel like I can't do that with games with multiple endings, so I found all of the endings and then I can like put them together in my mind, not like combine them, but like have a full picture of the way that these developers had thought about their world and their characters and all the possible ways they could have gone. And then from there I can kind of make judgments about the characters or how they,
Mhm.
what could have gone down and what it all means.
Yeah, well, let me
Um,
clarify something that I did say in passing. When I say it's
yeah,
that they used it to good effect, I think I mostly mean that like
yeah,
people were interested in playing those games and people talked about how cool it was that they had
right,
different endings.
sure,
Narratively, I do think it has some serious
yeah,
problems that I'm not actually
right,
sure are
yeah, exactly.
fixable.
Okay, good.
Like I get
Yeah,
I get why
yeah,
developers do it, and I just sort of explained why it's tempting for them to want to fork the storyline at the end, but
right.
it does create an it's hard to make a satisfying ending that way. At Mass Effect, I think it was 3, is notorious for this. Like, depending on what decision you made, like, the results were like a different colored light, like leaving the solar
Yeah,
system.
yeah,
And
yeah,
like,
yeah,
okay, so that's
yeah.
an example of like, it doesn't seem like your choices had that much consequence, right? But also, it makes
Right,
it
right.
hard to make a sequel because you're like, what's the base that you're working off? Like, which ending was the real ending? Some
Yeah, so
games have gotten around
yeah,
this by
what's considered
choosing
canon?
to read the save file, so you kind of have your canon. So you read the save file of the previous
Mm-hmm.
game and you go off of that. There's all sorts of problems with that. Obviously, if somebody, if you
Yeah,
change consoles, if you lose your save, if like I don't know, any number of
right,
things.
right.
But it does. I think it creates problems later on, and it also can destroy the narrative because if you're building up to a moment and then it's sort of this like wacky choose your own adventure thing. We've already talked about that.
Yeah,
Like, if at the end you get to choose whether or
right.
not to kill Voldemort, like as Harry, what? Like the whole series is about trying to kill Voldemort. You can't choose at the end
Yeah,
to just
sure, sure.
not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Exactly. That would be incredibly. I mean, unless there's like a very specific vision for that, and that they had been misleading you the entire time about why this was so important, and it had something to say. If you have the entire series, and then yeah, like yeah, that's not that's not effective storytelling in large part. When you've built an entire narrative around one thing, and then the character just completely like disagrees with or ignores that entire premise that the whole narrative is built
Right.
on, that's just
If you're
like
gonna if you're gonna
it's
do that, like that can be creative and
jarring.
subversive, but it's got to
Yeah,
be
exactly. Yeah.
intelligible looking back. Like you've got to be able to
Yeah.
look
Yeah.
like reflect on Harry Potter and be like, "Oh my gosh, Harry was like just playing people this whole time. I didn't notice, but now I can see it."
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you can't
Right.
just
Right. Right.
like
Something like
out of
that.
whole cloth be like, "Nope, by the way."
Yeah, yeah. We're just not going to address this. Like that, and that's the problem with because like to pull off what you're talking about, like that idea of going back and finally seeing it, that requires oversight of the entire story and knowing the entire thing by one person who get to make that
Right.
decision. Developers can't do that when they release the game with choices in it. So necessarily, yeah, it becomes this weird variable where yeah, you can just as the player completely rob all narrative integrity from the story if you want. Which I guess is fine. It's a weird thing too. Like I was thinking about this as you were talking, and of course, I was listening. I wasn't just like, yeah, I was zoning out because I don't listen to anything you say. And
Anyway,
no,
so what were we talking about,
um,
Greg?
yeah, right. But no, just the idea of like why, like of course, like of course, like I said, there's story, there's choice in games inherently, um, but why if either A we're completely wrong, which is entirely possible,
It's our
but
favorite
B,
answer.
um, yeah, exactly. If we're right, then like, and there is just like this weaker narrative, like just introducing story choices tends to make a weaker narrative. then why do companies put so much emphasis on like I swear like any single player game tries to like shoehorn like just on the back of the box even like deep immersive like meaningful player driven story. Like I swear player driven is like the just the byword for
Player driven,
everything.
mom approved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What could that possibly be used for?
I don't know.
Again, I don't know. A really safe car. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I guess just the players. Yeah, you play games because you want power and you want agency and you want the ability to affect your game. But like when I'm playing a player driven or a story game, like I don't necessarily want to feel like I have narrative power. I want to experience something really cool and be immersed in it and be part of it. And relate to it, and that doesn't require any choice on my part. That just requires my ability to be in the game.
I think that really ties back to you just being a different sort of gamer than the people who would really enjoy a game that focuses more on exploration. Like, and we're going to talk about Breath of the Wild next week, but Breath of the Wild, like the narrative, it might be terrible, right? You show up in this world, you go.
There's not a whole lot of narrative.
You go
actually.
and you kill Ganon, and that's
all told in flashbacks, basically.
Like you could make the narrative really weird, but it's because the game is not so much about the narrative, it's about the exploration. And so the people who are going to be drawn to that game are going to be people who enjoy games for the sake of exploration and autonomy. Games for the sake of immersion and character building and story might find themselves unsatisfied with that.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, because, like, I don't know. So Skyrim's another great example, right, of a game. I don't know. Skyrim was not praised for its main quest line, right? Like its story, necessarily. I think the story was all right. But again, in a game like that, it's so hard to build a character. Like you can play, again, mechanically you can, but from like a slightly kind of like the natural role playing that you just have to do if you're going to play a story game. Not like a full on like, always thinking in your character's voice and building a backstory, but just naturally you have to play in a certain way that seems semi-consistent with something. Whatever that is, even if it's a complete maniac. I don't know, with Skyrim, like that's...
I was going to say in the case of Grim Fandango.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's the other well-known, well, maybe not well-known, but classic joke about adventure games. In large part, every adventure game protagonist is just kind of like a psychopath.
Yeah.
They just kind of like take things from random people, and usually something breaks or explodes or, and then they just move on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, kind of just seemingly without any semblance of care or anything like that. Anyway, I was saying with Skyrim, and like Skyrim's like choice, right? That's largely mechanical in terms of the way you build your character and the things you do. And there's tons of little choices, and it's not like Knights of the KOTOR, like Knights of the Old Republic, where it's you have a wheel and you get to say yes or no. It's like there's tons of choices that present themselves at every point. Like, do you want to steal? Do you want to be a thief? Do you want to steal from this town? And then the natural consequence of having the guard come down on you, or do you want to attack this mammoth and know that two giants are going to come out and chase you down? That reminds me of my favorite Skyrim story by far when I was playing. But I basically got betrayed by my horse. I was getting chased. I was trying to kite this giant. I was super under-leveled, and my horse was following me, and I knew that the horse could outrun the giant, and I couldn't. So I kept on kiting the giant, just running a little bit, shooting air at him, running a little bit, and just over time, he eventually was going to catch up. And I knew when he did this, I'd hop on my horse and run away. And my horse had been just like perfect through this whole time, and it probably got triggered by fear when the giant got close enough. But basically, I shot the last arrow and turned around, and it just bolted and galloped away from me, like almost spitefully. And then I turned around, the giant was there, and it hit me, and it was perfect because it was like this horrible moment of betrayal by my loyal steed. But also the game did one of the kind of the like physics glitches where I got hit by the giant, and I just went like as if I was attached to a rocket. I just went like outside the game world, just straight up. I was like, "You tricked!" Boom! And I just like got launched.
Curse, you're something but inevitable betrayal.
I know, it was really funny. I don't know. It took like I was laughing at my screen for like 2 minutes. I got to stop playing. It was just the funniest thing. My horse had been so calm and fine, and then decided like right in my moment of need, just be like, "Nope." I have no idea what the point I was making was anymore.
It ties in with our discussion about choice mechanics, though, because the way that Skyrim does choice mechanics is very, very subtle, right? I
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so actually,
You can just
yeah,
do
you can
things,
just
right?
do things.
And you have consequences. It's a great feedback loop. You do something, something happens immediately, and then you can
And
choose,
there
make another
are,
choice.
to be fair, there are dialogue trees as well in Skyrim. So it has
Yes. Yeah.
both. But so actually, it's a good game to talk about to highlight both. The two main ways that
Sure.
games do decisions are either you're talking to somebody and then you choose what to say next. In
Right.
games that are dialogue heavy, this tends to be the best way, frankly, to do choice because how do you do like free form textual response? Like you can't, like
Right.
that's
Exactly.
not going
Yeah.
to happen.
That's
We're not
that's a
there
whole
yet. That would be
separate
pretty
program.
cool, but uh, what if you had a game that actually could interpret what you were saying and then, anyway,
Yeah. Right. And then have the character respond in a completely unique
yeah, that would be
response.
amazing. But we're not even close to that yet.
That's just virtual
That's a
reality at
lot
that point, man.
of that's a
Like
lot of
true
natural
virtual
language
reality.
processing. But then, when in terms of choices and
Yeah.
actions, games like Skyrim or Red Dead Redemption does this pretty frequently, where you can make a choice to kill a guard or to rob a house, and then the world will respond, noticing that you did something. And that's a great way to build
Right.
immersion and a sense of player agency because they're like, oh my gosh, people notice what I'm doing. Like, if you pull
Right.
out your
Totally.
gun in the middle of a town in Red Dead Redemption, people run for cover. And like,
Yeah.
there are lots of other games where you could just like be walking around town with like your, the sword the size of like your body drawn. Nobody bats
Right.
an
Yeah. Exactly.
eye.
Where you have a rocket launcher and everyone's just
Hey,
like,
how's it
eh.
going? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the classic one. Like in World of Warcraft, you can play a warlock, which are supposed to be these kind of shunned evil magic users, and you actually summon demons in the center of like a market square, and like vendors don't do anything, don't flip it out. They'll like sell you bread when you have this like absolute like objectively evil
Right.
thing there with you that has probably killed their family. Um, so this so when you're talking about that, I feel like that's a slightly different. Those are cool, like meaningful choices, and that's like mostly immersion. But those, I was thinking for Skyrim anyway, and I've actually never played Red Dead, but I heard good things. Anyway, it those don't actually have story consequences in large part. Like if you run around as a complete psychopath in Red Dead and you kill a bunch of people, obviously, like you said, like people will react to you differently. But like, if you then kept on trying to play the main story with the story change, because in Skyrim, I don't think that's true. You can go around and you can get this horrible rep and you can get a huge bounty on your head and make it life really difficult.
Right.
Or you could become part of the thieves guild, or you could and within the side quests there that makes sense. But in terms of the overall narrative of the game, I don't think any of that changes your ability to do that.
Yeah,
Right?
they've decoupled the exploration and autonomy systems from the unfolding drama of the actual game, which is
Which might be the
brilliant.
best way to
Yeah,
do that.
I
I don't
think that
know. I
that's a
mean,
that's a really cool idea. It can feel artificial when the
right? It
king
does.
wants to partner with you to like bring down this big bad, and like, oh yeah, by the way, I've been terrorizing
And
towns for the last 4 hours. Like,
yeah,
what?
yeah. I just kill children like often,
And so like that
but yeah, you can
that
count on
breaks
me.
immersion for the player, but it does allow
Right,
people who are really exploration and autonomy focused to have their cake, and the people who want to just
right.
play the story and hear about this world and what's happening in it also have their cake. It allows you to have your cake
Yeah, yeah,
and
totally.
have your cake. The classic
Yeah,
phrase.
yeah. That's the classic idiom there.
Exactly.
You can't have your cake and have your cake. Sounds like it sounds like it's like something Michael Scott would say.
In Red Dead Redemption,
Yeah.
there are some consequences in the story.
There's so much cake in Red Dead. Is what we're trying
There's
to
a
say.
lot of cake.
There's just a lot of
It's
cake in
it's
the
the
game.
old west. Cake was everywhere. It was bad.
Yeah,
It was really
yeah.
bad.
It's very historically
Right.
accurate.
No, but there are some consequences in the storyline, but I would
Okay,
say it doesn't
not
it
much.
doesn't like fork entirely. Like from a
Yeah,
content
totally.
standpoint, that's almost impossible to do anyway. Like to really have it
Yeah,
be a
totally.
completely different game.
And that's like I was saying, like that's I think that kind of choice is cool, right? That level, this is like another kind of like meta level choice of the player deciding how to play the game, and this is gets a little bit away from story, but not really in some ways, because like the coolness of Skyrim that at least in my experience of it was that I didn't play too much of the main quest, which was cool. It's a perfectly fine, kind of like high fantasy hero's journey story of finding out your special and your ancient and yada yada
You're
yada.
a wizard, Harry.
Yeah. God, they should have done that. Yeah. Um, but also the cool thing with that was that it's such a deep game and kind of sandboxy that again, this goes back to early discussions of emergent gameplay and player created, but like there's so many tiny little narratives that I wrote for myself just out in the world. Like I said, that little stupid giant one, or just it's such a deep and storied and complex world and character progression system, that there's so many things you can do and so many fun little stories that I kind of made. Not even like writing a narrative to, but just things that happened in a sequence, and that led me to do this, and that led me to do this, and suddenly, you know, you've played for 2.5 hours and done nothing in terms of the main story quest, but you have had an engaging, fun time,
right.
you know, and not even in like a GTA way where you just go around blowing stuff up and you drive a jet plane through downtown. Like that's just fun,
right.
period. But like Skyrim was like I found little stories that happened, which is really cool. So. And that way, yeah, the game gives the player the choice of, hey, do you want to play a very traditional, straightforward RPG storyline where we give you the story and you do stuff, or you can go out in the world and kind of make your own, really, truly, in the way you interact with stuff. And maybe not have like dialogue to go along with it, but you can have like these little tiny little arcs, you know, where you go to a random bandit camp and then you find an item that gives you a story to, you know, a kind of a crumb to a different area, and then you follow. It's not even a proper side quest. It's just there's things in the world to do.
Right. Yeah.
And then you've done it, and then you feel like your character has done this and has this experience, and you can build on that, and maybe they'll do something else because of that. You know.
And I think it's really cool when games can actually like give
cool
a nod to that later on. But
right. That's really, really freaking hard, I think, to then incorporate. Like, I feel like those two are separate, right? You either have kind of the player-driven thing, or you have the scripted one, and it's really hard to make the scripted one interact with the player.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's why in Skyrim they're largely separate, and probably most games that's
right.
And that's even just like a limitation of like a development budget, and I think
right.
I think that might be the best it's going to get in terms of developing a game.
So we've been largely talking about, you know, story, and then you have an interesting. I can only think of one example of this. I'm sure there's many more. I guess to an extent. Again, I think SWTOR and KOTOR might do this a little bit. But basically tying together, like I said, we'll kind of next week we'll talk more about the mechanics of decision making. But there are times where those intersect, actually. Like the one I played the most that stood out to me the most was a game called Infamous, back on the PS3. Actually got that. I don't know if people remember. This was years ago, but the PSN system got hacked horribly. And it like gave up credit cards and billing info.
That's right. I remember that.
And as a response to that, basically, Sony gave everyone with a PSN account, free month of PSN Pro, which back then I didn't even know what it did because you didn't need it to play online. But anyway, you also got a free game, and the free game I picked was Infamous, which is a great game. But what it does is it has a really black and white, just two-sided morality system where you have choices, and you can either do good ones or bad ones, and you can basically choose to be a hero or a villain in the story. You're a dude with super electrical powers. It's great. You can just conduct electricity and shoot lightning. And so outside of, like I said, they have all these story hits and things you can do and choose. And it makes it super clear which ones are going to be good and bad. But outside of that, there's also tied to that is a progression system. So there's a bunch of powers you can only access if you do bad things, and a bunch of powers you can only access if you do good things. And so that's an interesting little in-between where suddenly you're not just making choices based on the way you want the story to go or how you think of the character or want the character to be or how you want to interact with the story, but you also have to consider the way the game's going to play after that, which is, in an Infamous case, I don't know if they quite nailed, we'll talk about this a little bit, but one of the main theses we came up with for choices in game design, at least, is that you have to, if you're going to give people multiple choices on a way to play the game, they both need to be able to be like
viable,
interact well with the core design of the game.
Right.
And in Infamous's case, it's largely combat based, where you kill stuff, you kill enemies. And the bad skill tree, had tons of very destructive abilities in it, and just kind of made you killier. And the good tree had more like kind of control based abilities, where you like had movement and shielding and stuns and.
Sorry, did I hear a
and you could be really precise. I did. Yes, that was precisely the word.
Okay.
Yeah, and Anyway, so the game kind of actually incentivized you to just play the evil side because it was a better skill set in large part. It did the same stuff as the good side, just better.
Yeah.
Because you just kill stuff instead of kind of having these big workarounds. Which, Mark, you had a cool thought about that, which I don't think Infamous was trying to do, but may have unintentionally achieved something kind of cool.
It's you've actually come full circle into something that I wanted to mention anyway, but what I mentioned was I know,
Fantastic.
right? This is perfect. We never coordinate things. Uh, no, it's
Not intentionally.
so in real life, often it's easier to take a shortcut or to be bad, to steal rather than
Just kidding.
to like work a job, right? I mean, this is like
It's got deep real quick. So basically, what we're trying to say is easier to steal than to get a job.
so, yeah, stay in school, kids. No, but I
It's easier to not stay in school, Mark.
it is, it
You're
is.
proving your own point. All right,
Good
keep going.
shoplift. So it's an interesting point to make in a game that you can choose to be good, but that's going to come at a detriment to your powers and to your, I guess, advancement, personal advancement. And
Right.
actually, it's a lot. There's a lot more boxes to check to be good than to be evil. I
Intense.
actually contend that it's just harder in general to make a compelling story that has high autonomy where the character is good. Because
Yeah.
a bad character, more things are on the table for them. Especially because in a
Yeah.
game, often what you're giving the player are more and more ways to engage in combat, and to kill,
Right. Most games are combat
yeah,
based.
to kill things and to or to damage things or to disable people or however you want to phrase it. And
Right.
good people have limitations as to who they're going to use those things on. Bad people, not so much.
Yeah.
Even it's even more believable that a bad character would betray their own syndicate than it is for a good player to attack
Go
somebody on
back
the
on their morals,
streets.
right?
Like
Yeah.
it's actually more believable that a bad player would kill another bad player than it is that a good player would kill a bad NPC. Like
Right.
because
In many
they
points. Yeah.
have
Exactly.
if you kind of got the Batman thing going where you're sort of this person who refuses to
Very
take a
high moral
life,
high
yeah,
ground.
takes a moral high ground, then you have a lot more restrictions about what you can do. And as a player, you're going to feel those restrictions, and it's going to feel less like I have autonomy here. So if you really like autonomy, consider choosing the bad path because you'll probably get a lot
Right.
more
Yeah.
autonomy. It's just hard to do
Yeah. You
both.
have a lot more options, and have it be coherent at least. Like you said, in a you can keep on giving people all those choices, and you said just like break character entirely, basically break immersion, break
Right.
consistency, and do that. But yeah, if you want like a consistent uh, set of traits and someone who acts semi believably, then yeah, evil characters would probably tend to do that. It's interesting that you bring up the good. I was thinking about like games with. Like I was thinking of GTA. We talked about it a little bit, but that's again that'll have tons of. We'll probably bring that up next week in terms of choice on way to play games, as opposed to the story. But those games have really linear stories,
Right.
um, and are also hugely lauded for those stories. I mean, actually, I've never played a GTA game through, to my own detriment. I'm sure. I hear they're fantastic, but I know enough about kind of the themes and the stories, and usually those are praised for their really wonderful nuanced depictions of good and evil, of gray, kind of getting at really difficult moral quandaries and poverty and racism and inner city, kind of urban
Hmm.
environments, and how unclear a lot of that is. Very very human, very real. And the only reason they can do that, I think, it's interesting because, like I said, the GTA is normally lauded for its incredible ability to give you choice on how to play, but in a story sense, I don't think it is at all. And the reason they can tell those really nuanced gray stories is because I think it's entirely choiceless on the player's part, right?
Right.
Like I think you kind of going back to what I said, I don't know if it necessarily dilutes, but maybe just makes simpler. You have to make simpler stories if you're going to give your player a whole lot of choice on what to do in the story, because you can't really explore these really nuanced. I've said nuanced like 10 times. I can find a different word. These really complicated, or
Nuanced, I
um,
think is the word.
I think the word you're looking for is nuanced. Yeah, no, just really, like I said, human stories about people and all of the randomness that comes with that.
Yeah.
I think that's something that you really have to craft
Yeah.
specifically, because because otherwise you can very, very quickly undermine a theme or a character if they act out of whack or outside of a certain way to drive a point home.
Yeah,
So
that does it reminds me of the signal to noise stuff I said earlier. But like, if you're trying to make very subtle
yeah,
points, you have to have a lot less noise. Like, otherwise, those subtle
yeah,
points are
sure.
going to be missed because you've given the player the opportunity to just trample all over this subtle theme that you were building with some choice. Um, it's
Which
Go ahead.
sorry, go on. No, I was actually, if you have something else to say, I was gonna kind of pose a final ending
Oh,
question.
okay. Well, I was going to say it was reflecting on GTA that actually brought me to this realization that it's a lot easier to make a game where you're sort of this anti-hero who's got a lot of autonomy and choice than it is to make a game
Yeah,
where you're sort of this knight in shining armor where you have a lot of autonomy and
straight
choice.
up and down.
Because yeah,
Yeah,
straight up and down as the phrase implies, it means that there's a lot of restrictions about what you can do.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. No, that's
and I
makes sense. I'm glad it's very convergent thinking on our part,
It
Mark.
was. And I don't want to finish this episode without bringing up a video I saw by Mark Brown, who does Game Maker's Toolkit on YouTube.
Hmm.
And he talked about Until Dawn, which is a game that is touted as sort of a choose your own adventure
Oh yeah,
horror
yeah. Talk about
film.
this.
And it's he was basically the discussion in the video focused on whether or not the game succeeded at being a horror film, and he concluded that no, it doesn't really function like a horror film because there are certain tropes in horror films that in order to be a part of the genre you have to mostly follow. You can violate some of it to be creative, but you can't violate all of the genre. And uh, so in that way, it kind of failed to be a horror movie. But he did say that if
Right.
you make the game trying uh, to choose for the characters and to direct the players that you're controlling into behaving how characters would in a horror film, then uh, it becomes really interesting because you can try to make it like a good horror movie, and that actually the meta game becomes this game where you're trying to make a satisfying horror film out of this game, and
Right.
that
Right. That becomes the game itself, or at least the
right. And I think
the
it
task
would
of
be
the
so
player.
cool if a game actually ran with this and rewarded you for making decisions in alignment with a particular genre or a particular trope that the game is trying to communicate to you, and in that way incentivizes your decisions and gives you some guidance about what you should be doing. And you can choose to violate that, and that's fine. In your, like I said, good movies and good directors do violate some tropes, just not all of them.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, subvert it. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Basically, like, yeah, I think you put it this way even when we were talking earlier, but you were talking about basically being a director of the game more so than trying to immerse yourself
Right.
in the game. Like you said, there's kind of it's a meta. You have to step outside the game itself and kind of try to uh, manipulate the game as opposed to just being in it. But I think it's a really interesting idea, like trying to the game judging you on how well you're able to how compelling or how similar to a certain genre you're able
Right.
to make it. That's a really interesting idea. So that kind of leads me in this. I think you answered the question actually a little bit. Interesting enough, we're just on the same wavelength right now. It's great.
We're just
But
gonna do a two-parter.
which
We're going for
is
another hour. Let's do it.
yeah, right. Let's just get it
Strap
done.
in.
Uh, yeah, it made me think of a. I ever see it? It's a advertisement for like a toilet, like a kid's toilet seat, but it has like straps for the kid's legs and like a bar that comes
Oh
down.
God.
It's ridiculous, but it's fantastic. It's like yeah, and it's super colorful and like
I'm
90s
sure.
and it looks bizarre. Anyway, so my last question will be real briefly. So do you think we were talking about all of these ways that choices can mess up story and narrative, and we also started the episode by saying what makes games unique is the fact that you get to interact with them. So is by necessity, do you think video games are just an inferior medium to tell stories than say movies or television, because of that very thing that makes them
Hmm.
games? Like even the best game, like if you compare the best game and if you could somehow equalize for the amount of talent put into each one of them, right? Like of course movies tend to have better stories because they have 100 years worth of people making film and learning how to do that. And video game stories are relatively new, but But yeah, what do you think?
So I think that games are in a very unique position to get people invested in the story through interaction in a way that movies
Yeah, exactly.
can't. And so
Yep.
even if the story itself from like a literary criticism standpoint is inferior, the player can feel more
Right.
connected to the events of the story because they had a hand in helping them unfold or shaping the way that they
Come about.
unfolded. And so if you
Yeah.
have a chicken feeder simulator and you feed this chicken faithfully for a year and then it dies in your chicken feeder simulator, you're going to feel way more attached to that chicken than you would if you saw a movie that showed the life of a chicken over a year and then it killed over at the end. Right? Like
I,
that would be a
you're
totally
absolutely right.
bad
That's a great
story.
example, actually. That's really great. No, and you probably would have emotion invoked in you when your chicken died in the game
Right.
version, right? Like you actually feel something, and you'd understand something slightly more about yourself, as opposed to watching a movie of someone doing that and the chicken dies, and you'd be like, "Damn."
Right.
You'd feel probably a sense of disappointment that you just invested that much of your life and the chicken
Right.
died. Like that would be the amount of regret. Like that would be the only feeling.
Right. And so the way that movies will
That's a damn good example.
well, maybe I've thought about this before, but
Oh,
but
okay.
the way
Okay.
that movies communicate this is by giving a person in the film with whom you can empathize, who does care about the
Right, you'd put
chicken,
yourself in.
and then you put yourself in the shoes of Timmy, who loves this chicken, and then you feel something
Yeah.
for Timmy. But in
Yeah.
a game, you can bypass the middleman, and you actually can have the experience
You are
of
the
having
chicken.
cared for the chicken.
Oh
You're
wait, no,
not the
did I miss the
chicken.
metaphor?
No, you're not the chicken.
I know. I'm just.
But there are things that the game
So you're saying more games should have
that's
chickens?
really what I'm saying. In summary,
Mm-hmm.
there are things though that the game
Good.
can do to highlight your caring for the chicken. Like it could give you a name prompt. It could give you like a way to upgrade the coop so that there's like a nice place for the chicken to live. And so like there are all these ways you
Yeah,
could
sure.
build up an attachment to this chicken. And then when it dies, like yeah, you like you said, you might learn something about yourself, or you might have an experience that you might not have already
I could.
experienced. Maybe the thing you learned is that you ought to own a chicken.
Yeah, that you should have a real chicken, or maybe you shouldn't because you know you'll attach yourself so heavily to a real chicken, and the pain will be that much greater in real life.
Exactly.
And so hence now you know you shouldn't have chickens. No, yeah, I feel like that could actually be like a weird artsy game that like people don't know what to do with, but are like, wait, this is actually kind of good,
Right.
you know?
And so I think that on like that's a very distilled example, but I think games can do that.
That's all we do
Yeah,
here.
distilled examples. I think games are in a much better position to create that sort of engagement with players than any other form of media
Yeah,
because the investment is so clear. Like you're the one
yeah,
who's making these choices and spending the time. Games take a lot of time and a lot of active,
yeah,
interactive time where you're shaping what's happening, and so you get a
yeah,
lot more
exactly.
buy-in from people. And so even if the stories aren't as good, I've already said this, but even if the stories aren't as good, it can still be a compelling experience.
Yeah, man. I actually once again very much agree with you. That was going to be a very similar point I was going to make, which was I think in general you have more ability to really ensure that what your audience experiences is what they get via movies and TV because you get to craft every aspect of what they see.
Right.
In a game, even a game that you have no choice in the story, you know, you can take longer time in combat, or you can go around and you can ditch around or not. You know, like there's just a lot of and game pacing is a lot different, right? In terms of story, movies are structured so the story feels good. Games usually you'll have a lot of combat in between stuff, and just in terms of time, it usually feels weird. That being said, I think you make up for it entirely, like you said, in terms of the interaction and the fact that you are just implicitly putting yourself into the game and experiencing it. And like about like you know like if you were to watch the Final Fantasy VII movie and Sephiroth kills Ares, spoiler.
What the
Um,
heck?
I know. And then you get to watch Cloud fight Sephiroth, and you're like, yeah, get him, Cloud. Like, yeah, you're so like make him pay. When you're playing it, you are the person who's actually attacking Sephiroth, and in this case, you know, it's like turn based, so it's a little bit less. But like, it's a game where you have finally get to something horrible happens, and you get to fight the person who does it, and you're just raging, and you get to actually put that into the way you're
Right.
fighting him. You know, like you get to put that into just wanting to completely f him up. Um, that's super engaging, right? In that moment, as a player, as a person, you are like entirely engaged in the story in a way that you probably very rarely can get in a
Right.
movie. You are completely emotionally involved and part of the narrative and playing into the narrative, right? By how you're playing the game. So I think I would agree. I think they're fundamentally different. and I think it's a heck of a lot easier to make a good story in a movie. I think it takes more from game developers to make a really, really good one. But I don't know, man. I think when they really nail it, uh, it's something
Yeah.
else.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting to think that video games are also like I would say second in terms of the amount of time to books that it takes to experience a video game. Like a movie is like it's
Yeah,
always
yeah,
two
probably.
hours, right? I mean, or TV show.
Right. Yeah, you're just
But
done.
like I guess maybe like long form sort of TV shows where there's episodes and episodes could be on par with a video
Yeah, no,
game.
TVs are
TVs,
TVs. Yeah, no, TV tends to be. I think you could make a case that would be getting there with other stories, but also that's the other thing with TV is that in general people say that TV is a better storytelling medium for character development, right? Because you get to see them over all of this time and all these hours and all these different situations. Suppose in a movie you have to have this 2 hour character arc basically for everyone. TV and games also give you just way more ability to be outside that. So
cool. Well, next week, you're going to talk about that.
yeah, we are. That's exactly what we're gonna do. If you are interested in this sort of thing, you're in luck because literally we're just gonna probably keep on talking about the same thing, which is gonna be just to reiterate choice as a game mechanic and the ways the games ask you to make choices and the ways that you can and all the different ways that impacts your experience of the game
Yeah,
outside of necessarily the story.
we're going to be specifically focusing on mechanical choices. We'll introduce those phrases later, but like choices you can make within the game about just like how to build your character, and what it looks like to do those things well.
Good ways to do that, bad ways to do that, frustrating ways to do that, and common ways to do that, which there tends to be some overlap in my mind between the frustrating and the common,
Fair enough.
but yeah,
All
cool.
right.
Well, thanks as always for listening. To anyone listening, if you want to start, tell us how stupid we are, how smart we are, or just how horrible a word Killy is, I
Yeah,
believe.
Killy. No,
Or was it Killy?
yeah,
Or
I think it's Killy. In Infamous? I
yeah,
want
did
to
I
play
use
Infamous
Killy?
now just to see the killiness.
The Killiness? Yeah, I think it was Killiness. Then you can drop us a line at Gaming Mechanics at gamingmechanics.net, is it? Or
Net.
org?
Yep.
Or
Yep. You
is it
can
net? Okay, I always
email
get that
mark
wrong.
at gamingnmechanics.net or
And
Gregor
yes.
at gamingnmechanics.net, and that will get to us respectively.
Yep. And that's it. So thanks so much for listening, guys, as always. And we will see you next
All
week.
right. See you guys.
Peace out.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.